A very, very warm welcome to visitors particularly, but also to regulars here. We are a bit thin on the ground. There are some people up in the expensive seats as well, so welcome. And Charlie told us the answer to this question, but who can just tell me what the theme of these series of sermons is all about?
Worship.
Thank you, Mark. Worship. It's about worship. And those of you that are regulars will remember that Tim kicked this off by addressing the issue of what do we worship. And then Charlie followed on a few weeks ago on worship as devotion. And last week, Anya and Andrew, the Magic Duo Act, talked about worship in a secret place. And today, we're going to look at worship as surrender. And when I saw this title, my heart kind of sank, because I'm the worst person to talk about this, probably in this entire church. Because surrender for me is really difficult. I'm quite a competitive individual. When I played rugby, I hated losing. And when we have the men's cycle rise, I hate stopping at red lights. So I've got a nickname, I think. Alex, what's my nickname?
Red Light Robin.
Red Light Robin, because I tend to, I shouldn't do it, but if there's no traffic, I just go through the red light. So I'm quite competitive, and Gretchen, my wife, would say I'm quite stubborn, because I'm always right, even when I'm wrong. And so I find it difficult to admit that I'm wrong, and I don't like the concept of failure. So for me, surrender is really difficult. And some of you may be old enough to remember the Simon Garfunkel song, I am a rock, I am an island. And that's a bit like me. Independent, stubborn, competitive, and I like to win. Now obviously that doesn't apply to you. You're all very different. But preaching on the theme of worship as surrender made me rethink this word surrender. Because when I think of surrender, I don't know about you, but I think of losing something. Like in the Genesis passage, which we're going to go back to later, it's about surrendering to in a wrestling match. Okay, so when you're on the floor in a wrestling match, you know what happens if your shoulders are pinned down, then you tap the floor 3 times and you surrender. And in a battle, you surrender, you give up. So in a fight, surrendering means to give up, and it's a sign of weakness, isn't it? If you give up, you've lost. You're giving in. So when I approach these passages, I had to change my mind because surrendering is very different in the context of these passages. Surrendering is something we do all the time because we have to put something at the centre of our lives and then we surrender our lives to that thing we put at the centre. So it's a bit different from giving up. It's almost like taking on the worship of something else. You're surrendering your life to something. And when Tim spoke, he talked about the sort of things that people surrender their life to. And I would be useless on Blue Peter, but I've got some visual aids here, so I don't know if you can see these. But one of them that people surrender their lives to is the idea of money. Right? Now we're talking about surrendering obsessively and in excess, because everybody needs to earn money to live. But some people put that at the centre of their lives. And if you develop a passion for money, if that's why you're on earth, to get richer and richer and richer, you become greedy. And that's not good. So for some people, they surrender their lives to money. Some people, this is very topical, isn't it? Surrender their lives to food. During August, we can go out to a restaurant, if you've still got any money left in your pocket, and you can get £10 off a meal. This at the very same time we're being encouraged to get fitter and eat less, so there's a bit of a contradiction there going on. But actually, some people live for food, not just eating it, but they take pictures of every meal they eat. Put it on Facebook. Food is the centre of their lives. It's as though they're obsessed by it and they can't live without food. Another one that Tim mentioned is the idea of power. We live so that we can have power over other people. And ultimately, if that's all you live for, that's what happens to power. Falls down. ultimately what happens is you become corrupt because that's what you want, power. Doesn't matter how you get it or how you hold on to it, you just want power. You want the feeling you can control other people. These are all things people base their lives on, and you may think of other people or even yourself that actually are obsessed by these things. Another one, I'm not sure our table's going to be big enough to take this, is to live as long as you can. So you live your life, and success in your life is to live to get a telegram from the Queen when you're 100. That's the way you measure your life. The longer you live, the better. And so your behaviours and your lifestyle is geared towards living as long as you can. Not taking risks, perhaps, looking after your body, and so on. Maybe even taking certain potions to keep you alive longer. Right, I've got one more. I have to put this in front of these. And this is one I particularly want to talk about, because I think it's relevant to all of us, or many of us here, and that is the idea of self-image. Many of us spend a lot of our time trying to look good, going to the gym, taking care of our appearance by going to beauty people, buying fashion, keeping up to date, buying lots of clothes, so we throw clothes away because we get new clothes to replace those clothes. And self-image is really important for some people. We spend a lot of time and energy and money, and as Tim said when he spoke, what we worship is measured by the time, energy and money we spend. Time, energy and money. And if we spend a lot of time and energy and money on our appearance, then that ultimately is not a good thing. I'll give you an example of this, and it applies to many people in this room. I have a photograph here of a young man. Can anybody recognise in the congregation who this young man is? Right? Yes, look at that young man, young lady there.
It's a young lady.
No idea.
See this? This is a young man aged 21, and he has long flowing hair. I was very fortunate to grow up in the formative years, my formative years, the 60s and 70s, which is way before everyone in this church was born. And it was very fashionable to have long hair. If you wanted to be a hippie, you had to have hair down to your shoulders and longer. And so that was me. And then when I got a little bit older, it started to disappear. And there are one or two people here who will resonate with that. Your hair goes at a certain age, maybe 30, 40. Mark, how old were you? 32, and you wake up and suddenly it's disappearing. And those of you who got full lots of hair, beware, because it may affect you. It clicks in. You know, what am I going to look like without any hair? You look like my dad maybe, or my granddad, or whatever. So your hair comes out, and it is a time when self-image becomes really important. What do I look like? Now the irony is that a lot of people are shaving their heads and growing beards, and so again, going back to Mark looks very trendy now. If he was in Shoreditch, he would be very fashionable with a bald head and a big beard, because things change. But when you're a young man and you lose your hair, it's about self-image, isn't it? And so those one or two people who are in that situation or being in it perhaps will agree. So putting these things at the centre of your life in excess is not a good thing to do. And why not? Well, one is the more you have, the more you want. So if it's money, you'll never be satisfied. If you're a multi-millionaire, you want more money. So that way lies actually dissatisfaction. Some people, the very few people I know that are very rich, are not necessarily very happy people. Second, it's addictive. You get your kicks, if you like, by getting more of it, more food, more exercise, whatever. It becomes addictive. And ultimately, it's not going to last. It's not going to last. You can't stay young forever. You can only have these things even if you acquire them for your life on earth here. So they're temporary. They're temporary. So what's the alternative? If you don't worship these things, and you may be able to think of others that you would put on here, things that are the centre of your life. And we are talking about excess now. Well, the centre, the alternative, is to put a cross at the centre of your life. Put this as the alternative. And in the passage we have read from Genesis, it was a story that many are familiar with of Jacob and Esau, his brother. You may remember the story that they were twins and they were born to Isaac and Rebekah, and Esau came out of his mother first, so he was the oldest, and then came Jacob. And it was Esau that would inherit everything from Isaac, his father, but Jacob swindled him out of his birthright, basically. So for 20 years they were separated, and Esau had this grudge against Jacob for stealing what was his. And that's what Jacob, when we get to this passage, that's what's on his mind. It's his brothers coming after him. There's going to be a bundle, a fight. But actually what happens is this mysterious figure appears who is revealed as God and wrestles with Jacob. And as Evan read to us, there comes a point in the story where this figure, presented as a man, who we later discover is God, touches Isaac's hip and he becomes crippled. And then he realizes this is God and he walks away. So what the story is telling us about is that in people's lives, in order to get alongside God, sometimes we have to be crippled. Sometimes we have to be hurt. Sometimes things have to go wrong. And so what often happens when God approaches, a bit of a paradox, is that he will test us to see how strong we are, and then he will lift us up and make us stronger. And that's what happened to Isaac. Let me just read this to you. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." And I think that experience of wrestling with God, letting go, and God changing our lives, in this case, crippling Isaac, or Jacob rather, making us a stronger person. He puts us in difficult situations to test us, and we emerge stronger. It's a paradox. And it's there in the Lord's Prayer. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. It's a paradox, and it's a truth. I don't know about you, but in my life, when I've had trouble over relationships and over careers and so on, that's when God comes along and touches your hip, and you are changed, and you get stronger as a result. It's not necessarily what I would have done. I would have won the wrestling match. But looking back, you realise there was a plan. All made sense, all fitted together. And I think that's the truth for us, that we do get into wrestling matches with God, but ultimately God will win if we want to really engage with him, and our lives will change for the better. So there's a choice. And I would suggest to you that surrendering to God is not enslavement, it's not surrendering. Putting these things at the centre is enslavement. You're putting yourself in a prison, if you like, of addiction and worshipping things that have a short lifespan. Surrendering to God as a Christian is about liberation. It's not enslavement. It's taking us away from the world's values that trap us. Surrendering to God is about emancipation. It's about freedom. And surrendering to God is about salvation. So that's what Christianity offers, is a stark choice between this and this. This to excess, because we all have a bit of this, to excess. And in the Bible there are countless examples of people that have had the same experience as Jacob. Noah had to, for example, trust God when he went in the ark. He took a risk, and we know the consequences of that. Abraham, when God said, "Bring your son for a sacrifice," had to trust God in order to become greater And Jesus himself surrendered to God on the cross. So surrendering is about liberation, freedom, emancipation and salvation. It's not about trapping yourself in a world of addiction. So what do we learn from this? What do we learn from this? Well, several things, I think. 5 things I'm going to suggest to you. One is we have a choice. We can choose this, or we can choose this. And a little bit of a test now from last week. Can anybody remember the verse that Anya taught us?
96:21.
Thank you. Okay, almost. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And so, where is your treasure? Where's your heart? Where does it lie? That's the choice. James, in the reading we have from James, said, God opposes the proud, but shows favour to the humble. And the way we spend our money and time and effort, whether it's on leisure or looking good or whatever, that's about pride. That's about pride, largely. And so what God is encouraging us to do is not to worship these earthly things, which is about pride, but to worship Him, which is about humility. So that verse that Sarah read, God opposes the proud, but shows favour to the humble, is, I think, a choice between this or this. And so it's about humility. And this is urgent, this choice. We cannot sit back and think, well, I'll think about it, maybe in a few years' time I might come back to it, or maybe not. This is urgent. Because if we go down this route, it will become obsessive, addictive, it will take over our lives. And so we cannot afford to wait to make that first point, the decision about earthly or heavenly things being the centre of our lives. The second point is about submission to God. In other words, if we go for this route, we've got to give our lives over to God. What it says in James is, submit yourselves then to God. Resist the devil and he will flee from you. God has already defeated the devil. In other words, we put our lives in God's hands. And he takes charge of our lives. And we need to trust that. And that is pretty scary. Because we have plans for this, don't we? We have plans for work, we have plans for money, we have plans for buying houses, we have plans. All the time we have plans. And God is really good at tearing up plans. It's often said that if you start to plan your life, God's up there laughing his socks off because he knows it's not going to happen. And the last 6 months have taught us that. Hopefully, you can plan, but don't be surprised if it doesn't happen. And our lives are in God's hands, so we need to trust him. But he cares for us now and in the future. He's not going to lead us astray. He's not going to give us something that isn't right for us. So we need to submit. Thirdly, we all make mistakes. We all end up doing this. Going to the beautician, going to the gym, saving more money than we need. We all end up doing that. But we have a faith which means that we can go back to God and we can ask for forgiveness, and we can carry on focusing on what should be central to our lives. So when we fall down, we can dust ourselves off if we're genuine and honest with God, and then get up, walk upright on the journey of life. We have that faith which is remarkable, really. It's the truth about Christianity. There is forgiveness. Even when we move down this route, there is forgiveness. We all make mistakes. We all have idols beside God, and make other things our priority. But he will forgive us. So that's the third thing about forgiveness. The fourth thing is about drawing close to God. And if we go down the route of the cross, then we need to get to know God. And in James it said, come near to God and he will come near to you. How do we do it? Well, one is contained in the verse, wash your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts. You double-minded. And that's interesting, double-minded. This or this. And some people are both. They kind of go down this route and then flip back to this and they go back to this. And that's referenced in the Bible. Purify your heart. So we have to get right with God before we can engage with him. Prayer is really important. And Jacob, before he encountered God, we're told, was praying about the outcome of his life. And there is a prayer, which perhaps Mark will talk about later. There's an opportunity to improve our prayer through a course being run in this church. And I love the phrase that I don't know where Eben is, but she has the phrase push when she talks about prayer. Pray until something happens. Push. Pray until something happens. Because it will happen if you pray hard enough. Another thing is to read the Bible. Very important. And Anya and Andrew run courses on that, and this church takes Bible reading seriously. And the other thing we can do is just stop and notice God-given moments in our lives. Sometimes we're so busy we don't realise that God is at work. And show humility, stop, listen, and see the hand of God taking control of our lives. And sometimes we miss that. So that's the fourth thing. We need to draw closer to God. And the last thing, I think this passage, there are lots of things, but the last thing I want to point out is this tricky business of heaven. Not tricky, but if you're a Christian, we have a firm belief that this is a temporary home. There is much better to come. This is not the end. It's not even the beginning. This is just a temporary staging post on life. And if you worship these earthly things, that's it. It's going to disappear at some point, and what's left? What happens next? Well, Christians believe that the cross leads us to something unimaginably greater than what we're dealing with on earth. So I think for me, contained within those passages are 5 key points. One is we have a choice. This is urgent. We need to decide what we're going to do with our lives. If we choose the cross, we need to submit to God genuinely. We all make mistakes, and we can come back if we're honest and serious about that. We need to draw closer to Him through prayer, through Bible reading, through purifying our hearts, through taking more time to notice God in our lives. And this is temporary. There's something much better to come. So I just want to finish off by relating that to the world we're in now, in COVID. What's this got to do with the weird and strange and horrible situation we find ourselves in? I would argue, and I'm being controversial now because now some people in this church have been affected directly by COVID or have relatives or friends that have. But as a Christian, you should have a different attitude to COVID. As Christians, we should see it differently. This is very sensitive. We need to follow sensible guidance in terms of social distancing and washing and masks where that's reasonable. But there are three points I think that come for me out of COVID. One is we need to trust in God. Okay, we can do our best, and scientists can do their best, but ultimately God has a plan. And our lives are always full of uncertainty, disappointment, and surprise. And we should not be surprised to be surprised. We do not know what the future is. Yeah, but God has a plan for us. As Christians, we can rest in that peace and comfort that He's at the steering wheel. And we just have to let go, be sensible, but let go. Do you remember this passage from Matthew? Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothes? Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Can any one of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life? So do we really, as Christians, display this peace to the world that comes from trusting our God? Can people see, when we're out there, outside the church, that we've let go and let God take charge of our lives? So we need to trust in God during these difficult times. Secondly, I think also that this COVID crisis is a wake-up call. And as Christians, we really need to respond to that and consider and perhaps change the way in which we live here on earth. We are temporary visitors of this earth. We are stewards, God's stewards of this earth. And because COVID has been, like pressing the pause button, lots and lots of major global issues have been revealed, whether it's to do with the way we travel, the way we live our lives, about in the rich world, the way we deal with all those issues around sustainability. 25% of the world is starving. We have major global issues, and I won't go through them now because we get depressed. But I'm suggesting to you that as Christians we have a response as God's stewards on earth, and maybe this is the time where we wake up and take that more seriously than we have done. One of the sad things for me is that during the COVID lockdown we had lots of birds on our balcony, singing every morning, waking us up. That's gone. The traffic's back, the noise is back, it's disappeared. So I think there's a second issue about how we live on earth here, as Christians, which needs to be taken seriously. We cannot go on going on like this. Things need to change. Lastly, and then I'll stop, third thing about COVID is, and this is sensitive, is that about death. One thing that COVID has brought along is death with it. And this has come in different ways to different people. But as Christians, we would perhaps not be surprised to see death as part of the process. Life is temporary. It will end. But as Christians, we have a certainty there is more to come. And so that should not make us afraid of death. We should be wary of it and maybe afraid of dying, but we should not be afraid of death. Because as Christians, there's something much better in heaven after death. Only God knows where, when, and how we will die. So we should be living our lives responsibly as though it's today or tomorrow. We don't know when that's going to come along. Do we really believe this? Or are we storing things up, going to live to 100, planning to do that? Or do we really believe that this is a temporary home and that there's better to come? So in a sense, when we die, it's sad for the people left, but it's an irrelevance to us because there is something else. The best is yet to come. Amen.